Steam curled around Clara Whitmore as she stood beneath the shower, the hiss of hot water drowning out the distant hum of Ravenhurst's skyline, glittering beyond the tall windows. A view so breathtaking she could hardly believe it was hers, even if only on lease. And after the chaos of unpacking, she wanted nothing more than to wash away the exhaustion and the shadows of her past. But the fragile illusion shattered with a violent crash as the bathroom door burst open so hard the mirror shook, and Clara spun around clutching for her towel, her pulse leaping into her throat when she saw a tall man in a disheveled suit, dark hair swept back, chest rising and falling with the effort of pursuit. And though every part of him looked dangerous, it was his piercing green eyes, sharp like shattered glass, that froze her in place as they scanned the room and locked on her. She snapped at him to get out, voice trembling between fury and panic. But for a moment he looked just as startled as she was, his hands lifting slightly as though to surrender, though his gaze never softened. And when he stammered that he thought the place was empty, her cheeks burned with a mix of fear and anger as she accused him of barging into bathrooms without knocking, which drew a fleeting flicker of irritation and amusement across his face before he masked it with a crooked, mocking grin and replied that he only ever barged in when he heard something suspicious. A bad habit, he supposed. Before she could respond, his expression changed instantly, the grin vanishing as his eyes sharpened and darted past her to the window above the tub, his voice dropping into a low commanding tone, telling her to stay where she was. But Clara bristled, insisting it was her apartment even as he moved quickly across the tiles, scanning the shadows beyond the glass until both of them saw the ripple of movement and the groan of the window being forced wider. And then in a terrifying blur, a hooded intruder dressed in black lunged inside with a knife gleaming in his hand. Clara's breath hitched, and she pressed back against the sink. But the suited stranger reacted before she could scream, catching the attacker's wrist mid-swing, twisting until the blade clattered to the floor with a sound that cracked through the steam-filled room like a gunshot. As the two men slammed against the wall, grappling with brutal force, and while Clara stood frozen with her hand over her mouth, the stranger fought with lethal precision, every move efficient, practiced, merciless, until with one violent shove he pinned the intruder to the tile and growled for him to reveal who had sent him. But the hooded man snarled and thrashed in silence until the stranger ripped a towel from the rack and bound his wrists with the ease of a soldier. Clara's knees trembled as she clutched her own towel to her chest, watching in disbelief as the man finally turned to her, his breathing calm despite the fight, his green eyes locking on hers as he asked if she was hurt, and though her pulse raced, she managed to whisper no, thanks to him. Dragging the subdued attacker into the living room, the stranger barked clipped orders into his phone, and within minutes men in dark suits stormed in and hauled the intruder away, leaving Clara shaken and breathless as the room fell quiet until at last the stranger faced her fully, his expression softening only slightly as he rubbed the back of his neck and introduced himself. Damian Sterling, CEO of Sterling Enterprises, explaining that the man had been after files in his office and he had chased him here, never expecting to find her, and Clara, still gripping her towel tightly, replied stiffly with her own name, insisting it was her apartment, or at least it was supposed to be. But Damian's gaze lingered not with arrogance but with something deeper, his eyes falling to the silver heart pendant glistening against her damp skin, and for the first time his composure cracked as shock flickered across his face and his voice dropped to a whisper, asking where she had gotten that necklace, leaving Clara frozen as she lifted her chin and answered defensively that it was her mother's, and the only thing she had left of her, while Damian's haunted eyes darkened with recognition as he murmured words that struck her like a thunderclap. Because it belonged to my mother. Clara stood frozen in the living room, her towel clutched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, her mind struggling to process Damian Sterling's words as his gaze stayed locked on the pendant resting against her collarbone, the silver heart seeming to burn hotter under his stare, and when he whispered that it had belonged to his mother, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet, because the necklace had always been her mother's, given to her when she was a child, carried with her from town to town after tragedy had torn her life apart. And now this stranger with piercing green eyes and an unyielding presence was claiming it belonged to his family. Her heart pounded as she narrowed her eyes and insisted that he must be mistaken, that it had always been hers. But Damian stepped closer, his towering frame blotting out the city lights behind him, his voice low, steady, and unsettling as he told her that mistaken was not a word he often used, that the necklace was unique, given by his father to his mother before her death, and that he had not seen it in decades. Clara's chest tightened, every instinct wanting to deny him, to dismiss the absurdity, but a flicker of doubt crept in because her mother had always been secretive about her past in Ravenhurst and the powerful people who had once surrounded her. Before she could answer, a heavy knock rattled the apartment door, and Damian's hand shot up in a sharp motion commanding her silence as he opened it to reveal two men in dark suits. His private security, who reported that the intruder had been secured but was refusing to speak, and Damian's jaw tightened as he ordered them to handle it and get answers tonight. Before closing the door and leaving the apartment steeped in silence once more, Clara's voice finally broke through as she told him he had no right to interrogate her about her life, that she had just moved here and didn't know him or what he thought he had seen, but that she was not part of his problems. Damian's lips curled into something between a smirk and a warning as he told her that she thought he had barged in by accident, but in his world accidents didn't happen, that he had chased a thief into this building only to find her wearing a necklace he believed buried with his mother, and that made her his problem whether she liked it or not. Clara's pulse spiked at the arrogance in his tone and she opened her mouth to retort, but the lights flickered once, then twice, before dimming as if the building itself had shuddered. Damian strode quickly to the window, pulling back the curtain, and outside on the street a black sedan idled with its headlights off, shadowy figures barely visible inside. Clara's throat went dry as she asked who they were, and Damian's gaze hardened as he replied that they were enemies, though whether hers or his he did not yet know, but she needed to understand that by stepping into Ravenhurst, she had stepped into a game that killed people who were not careful. Clara lifted her chin, forcing herself not to let him see her fear as she told him she wasn't afraid of his world, that she had come to the city for her own reasons. And for the first time his mask slipped, a flicker of curiosity and even respect crossing his face as he studied her like she was a puzzle he could not yet solve, before speaking quietly almost like a vow that if she had enemies he would find them, and if she was his enemy he would destroy her. But either way her life would never be the same again. The pendant gleamed faintly in the low light between them, a silent witness to a past neither of them fully understood, and Clara felt the weight of his words pressing down on her chest as she realized that coming to Ravenhurst for answers about her mother had led her into something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Morning sunlight spilled across the skyline of Ravenhurst, but inside Clara Whitmore's apartment, the air still carried the weight of the night before, and though she had hardly slept, replaying every moment Damian Sterling stood in her doorway with his eyes fixed on the necklace she wore as if it were a ghost from his past, she forced herself to start the day. She wanted to believe it was coincidence that his words meant nothing, yet every instinct whispered otherwise. And when her phone buzzed with a message from the leasing office reminding her that the building was owned by Sterling Enterprises, the realization struck her cold. She was already living inside his empire whether she wanted to or not. She tried distracting herself with unpacking, but her thoughts circled endlessly back to Damian, the way he had fought off the intruder with effortless precision, the way his gaze burned with suspicion and recognition, and no matter how much she told herself he was nothing but trouble, his presence clung to her mind. Later that day she reported to her new job, a temporary assignment as an accountant in the city, just meant to sharpen her skills while she quietly pursued the real reason she had returned to Ravenhurst. But fate twisted cruelly when the receptionist at Sterling Enterprises confirmed that her assignment was in their corporate finance division. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she realized she was walking directly into the lion's den. The lobby rose around her in glass and marble, sunlight glinting off polished floors as employees moved with a blend of urgency and quiet fear. And in that moment Clara understood that Sterling Enterprises wasn't merely a company, it was a kingdom and Damian Sterling was its king. Keeping her head down and clutching her briefcase as if it were armor, she followed her new supervisor, a weary-eyed manager named Collins, who handed her a stack of files and muttered that they were routine reconciliations, though his voice trembled as if someone unseen might be listening. Settling at her desk, Clara immersed herself in columns of numbers, but the deeper she dug, the more unease coiled in her stomach, because the figures didn't align. Transactions slipped quietly into hidden accounts, and gaps were buried deep enough that most people would miss them, but she didn't. She had seen this pattern before, in her mother's journal, the same trail of financial shadows that had once destroyed her family, and as the clock ticked toward evening, the office emptied until only the hum of fluorescent lights remained above her. Clara leaned closer to the screen, tracing the threads of missing funds with racing pulse and tightening chest, each discovery pulling her further into something dangerous. Then a shadow fell across her desk and a low voice murmured, "You work fast." Her head snapped up to find Damian Sterling standing there, jacket slung casually over his shoulder, his gaze unreadable as it lingered on her. Clara tried to steady her breathing, pretending calm as she said she was just finishing the day's reports. But Damian leaned against her desk, his presence overwhelming, and his eyes flicked to the spreadsheet on her monitor as his lips curved faintly though without warmth. "Reports," he said, "or secrets?" She bristled but refused to shrink under his scrutiny, answering firmly that maybe she simply had a talent for finding what others preferred to hide. For a moment his lips curled into a faint smile, though his eyes stayed sharp, and his voice dropped to a warning that such a talent could make her powerful, or it could get her killed. Before Clara could respond to Damian Sterling's warning, her phone buzzed on the desk and the sharp vibration cut through the silence of the nearly empty office, making her jump. She reached for it quickly, hoping it was nothing more than a reminder or message from the leasing office again. But as her eyes scanned the screen, her blood turned cold. The text came from an unknown number, the words glowing with a menace that seemed to seep into her veins. "Leave Sterling while you can. Next time we won't miss." Her breath hitched and her fingers tightened around the device as fear pressed hard into her chest. Slowly her gaze lifted to Damian, who was still standing close, watching her intently, and though she hadn't spoken a word, he seemed to know exactly what the message said. His expression darkened instantly, the faintest flicker of anger sharpening his green eyes as if he had been expecting this, and with a slow step closer his voice lowered into a dangerous calm that sent a chill down her spine. "Someone is already watching you," he murmured, his words edged like steel. "The only question is whether they're after you because of me, or because of who you are." Clara's throat tightened, the message still burning in her mind as she stared back at him, her pulse racing faster than she could control. In that moment she realized that whatever secrets she had come to Ravenhurst to uncover were not hers alone, that her presence in this city had already drawn the eyes of people willing to kill to keep truths buried, and that Damian Sterling was now standing at the very center of it with her. Night descended over Ravenhurst in a wash of neon and shadows, the city alive outside while Sterling Enterprises stood silent and towering against the sky, and inside its vast marble halls Clara Whitmore moved quietly, telling herself she should have gone home hours ago, but unable to silence the restless pull that drew her back. She had tried to convince herself that staying was reckless after the message on her phone, but something stronger than fear urged her forward, something that made her footsteps echo in the empty corridors until she heard it, a faint melody drifting through the stillness, soft and haunting, the sound of a piano threading through the silence like a whisper from another world. Her heart quickened as she followed, the music to the far end of the grand lobby where a single piano gleamed under, the pale wash of moonlight spilling through the glass walls, and there he was, Damian Sterling, the man who had torn into her life like a storm, now seated at the keys with his shirt sleeves rolled, his tie discarded, his head bowed as his fingers moved with surprising tenderness. For the first time she saw him not as the ruthless CEO or the dangerous man who fought intruders in her bathroom, but as someone carrying a weight too heavy for his own shoulders. The melody trembled with grief, rising and falling like memories given shape and sound, and Clara lingered in the doorway, afraid to disturb it yet unable to leave. Then his voice broke the silence, quiet but certain. "You're not very good at sneaking," he said without looking up. She froze, admitting softly that she hadn't been trying to, and when he finally lifted his eyes to her, the mask of arrogance was gone, replaced with something raw and human. "Most people never see this side of me," he confessed, his gaze steady. "They wouldn't know what to do with it." Clara's chest tightened, her voice gentler as she replied, "Maybe they never tried." He studied her for a long moment, then shifted slightly and gestured to the empty seat beside him. Against her better judgment she crossed the room and sat, the closeness of his presence unsettling yet strangely grounding, and for a while neither spoke, letting the music fill the silence between them. At last he said quietly, "That necklace. I wasn't lying when I told you it belonged to my mother. I saw it on her the night she died. And now you wear it as if it were always yours." Clara's throat tightened and her fingers rose instinctively to the pendant, her voice trembling as she explained that her mother had given it to her before she died, that it was the only piece of her she had left. Damian's eyes sharpened, not with anger but with recognition, and his voice softened with gravity. Then perhaps our lives have been tangled far longer than either of us knew. Before she could answer, footsteps echoed above them on the mezzanine. A shadow moved across the glass balcony, and Damian's entire body tensed as he closed the piano with a soft thud and rose swiftly, brushing her hand as he pulled her to her feet. A man in a dark coat stood watching from above, raising a phone to his ear, and within seconds Clara's own phone buzzed with another message. Her hand shook as she read the words, "You are digging into graves better left untouched. Leave him or be buried beside him." Damian's jaw clenched as he took the phone from her trembling grip, his voice dropping to a whisper heavy with rage. "This is no longer coincidence. Whoever killed our parents is still watching us." The air between them thickened with dread, but beneath it a fragile thread connected them, a recognition that their fates were bound by more than a single necklace. The night of the Sterling Gala arrived with dazzling brilliance, the kind of spectacle only immense wealth could buy, and Ravenhurst's elite swept into the ballroom draped in silk and diamonds beneath chandeliers that blazed like captured stars. Clara Whitmore adjusted the deep blue gown she had reluctantly chosen, its fabric clinging to her with every step as though reminding her that she did not belong in this glittering world, her silver necklace glimmering against her skin and drawing curious whispers from those who noticed. She tried to tell herself it was just another party, but her stomach twisted tighter with every second as she crossed the threshold into the lion's den. Damian Sterling was already there, standing at the center of the room like a figure carved from stone, his presence commanding the crowd with practiced ease as his sharp green eyes scanned the sea of faces until they finally locked on hers, and for a fleeting moment something unguarded flickered across his expression, before he masked it with the usual iron control. When she approached, he extended his hand and said simply, "You came," and she placed hers into his, answering, "You insisted." His grip steady and grounding, though she could feel the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior. The evening unfolded in a haze of champagne and murmured conversations. But no matter where Clara turned, she felt eyes on her, whispers curling like smoke around the room as rumors about the mysterious woman at Damian Sterling's side spread with the speed of fire through dry grass. She wanted to disappear, yet Damian kept her close, his arm brushing hers, his presence both shield and chain, daring anyone to question her place. It was not long before Veronica Sterling made her entrance, Damian's stepmother sweeping into the ballroom in a gown that shimmered like ice, her smile sharp as glass and her eyes locking onto Clara instantly with a sweetness so calculated it stung. My, Veronica purred as she approached. So this is the woman who has all of Ravenhurst talking. Clara met her gaze without flinching, answering coolly that she hadn't realized gossip was such a prized currency here, and Veronica's soft laugh was edged with poison as she said that it was only valued when it was true, advising Clara to be careful because the city had a way of devouring those who reached above their station. Then her eyes dropped to the necklace resting at Clara's throat, and for the briefest moment the mask of composure cracked, recognition flashing like lightning before she smoothed it away, leaning closer to whisper that the necklace should have stayed buried, that Clara had no idea of the danger she invited by wearing it. Before Clara could respond, Damian stepped in, his voice firm though still polite as he told Veronica that she had other guests to charm, and after a tense pause his stepmother smiled once more, though her eyes glimmered with malice before she drifted away, leaving the air heavy with unspoken threats. Clara turned sharply to Damian, her voice tight as she told him that Veronica knew the necklace, that she recognized it, and his jaw clenched as he admitted that Veronica knew far too many secrets and had a talent for turning them into weapons. As the night deepened, the tension only thickened. Clara tried to ignore the weight of the stairs, but her phone buzzed again, and when she glanced at the screen, the message carved into her with icy finality. Don't trust him. He knows what happened to your mother. Her breath caught as she looked at Damian, his hand resting lightly at her back as he guided her through the crowd, her heart torn by the warning that echoed inside her like a blade. The orchestra struck up a new song, violins weaving a melody that seemed to mirror the storm inside her, and Damian leaned closer, his voice barely above the music as he whispered, "Stay close to me tonight." There are too many wolves circling. Clara forced a small smile, but inside her chest her heart pounded because she could not decide if the man holding her hand was leading her to safety or straight into the jaws of the pack. The Gala reached its height in glitter and applause. But beneath the polished surface, Clara Whitmore carried the weight of every whisper, every warning, every glance at the necklace that seemed to burn hotter against her skin, and though she smiled when required, her heart thudded with unease. Then the moment shattered like glass under a hammer. A gunshot ripped through the ballroom with a thunderclap, scattering screams in every direction as chandeliers trembled overhead, and chaos exploded among Ravenhurst's elite. Reporters dove for cover, glasses shattered, and the stampede of panicked guests shook the marble floor. Clara froze in shock until Damian Sterling's arm slammed around her, shoving her down behind the podium with such force she thought for one breath that he had shielded her completely. But then her eyes widened in horror as crimson bloomed across his white shirt. "Damian!" she gasped, her voice raw as his green eyes locked on hers with steady intensity. Even as pain carved through his features. "Stay down," he rasped, before his knees buckled and he crumpled against her, his weight heavy, his blood warm against her trembling hands. The shooter cut through the chaos, a scarred man with cold eyes, weapon raised, his attention fixed on the stage where she knelt. Clara's pulse hammered as panic swirled around her, people screaming for security, but no one could pull the gunman's stare from her. Just as he aimed again, Damian's security team stormed in from the side entrance, tackling him to the ground in a brutal clash, the gun skidding across the polished floor until it spun to a stop inches from Clara's hand. For one terrifying second she stared at it frozen, her fingers twitching toward the weapon, but before she could move, one of the guards kicked it away and restrained the shooter, dragging him back as his furious shouts echoed through the chaos. Damian lay sprawled across her lap, his breath shallow, blood seeping faster than she could press against the wound, and her tears spilled freely as she whispered fiercely, "Don't you dare leave me, not like this." "Not when I finally..." But her voice broke before she could finish. Paramedics fought their way through the stampede, cameras that had once been flashing for glamour now capturing a darker spectacle, the downfall of Sterling's glittering empire. Clara clung to Damian's hand until they pried her away as they lifted him onto a stretcher, her gown streaked with blood and her hair tangled from the chaos as she stumbled after them. At the hospital, the night dissolved into fragments, the blare of sirens, white coats rushing, doors slamming as they wheeled him into surgery, and Clara pacing the sterile waiting room with fists clenched, heart tearing itself apart with every memory of his warnings, his music in the night, his eyes fixed on her necklace as if it were both a memory and a curse. Hours dragged like centuries until at last the surgeon emerged, his face grim as he said Damian was alive, but the bullet had grazed dangerously close to his spine, that he had survived surgery but now lay in a coma, and they could not say if or when he would wake. Clara's knees nearly gave out as she collapsed into a chair, trembling violently, a storm of emotions raging inside her, rage at Veronica, at Donald Langston, at the unseen hand that had pulled the trigger, grief at the thought of losing the only man who had stood beside her, guilt that he had taken a bullet meant for her. When Damian's grandfather, Walter Sterling, arrived an hour later, leaning heavily on his cane, his voice rough with age and secrets, he sat beside her and whispered that this was never supposed to reach her, that Veronica and her allies had been cleaning blood from their hands for decades, that her mother, his son, and now Damian had all been caught in the same ruthless web. Clara's breath caught as she asked if he had known, and Walter's eyes glistened as he admitted he had suspected, but never had the courage to stop it, that perhaps Damian might if he survived. When at last she was allowed into Damian's room, the machines hummed softly around him, his chest rising and falling with the fragile rhythm of borrowed time. She sat beside his bed and took his hand, her voice trembling but fierce as she whispered, "You fought for me when no one else would, and you are not allowed to leave me now, do you hear me? Damian Sterling, wake up and fight with me." For a long while there was nothing but the steady beep of monitors, then suddenly his lips moved, barely audible over the hum of the machines, his whisper weak but real, "Couldn't leave you fighting alone." Clara's head snapped up, tears blurring her vision as his eyes fluttered open, and in that fragile moment she knew he had survived, but also that the war they had stumbled into was far from over. The morning air over Ravenhurst was sharp with the scent of salt and steel, the kind of air that made the city feel alive and hungry. But on the balcony of her apartment, Clara Whitmore stood clutching the necklace at her throat, her mind spinning with fragments of last night, the scarred intruder's words, Damian's blood staining her hands, the damning documents she had uncovered, and the heavy silence of the hospital where he lay clinging to fragile life. Every road led to Veronica Sterling, the woman whose smile was poison wrapped in diamonds, and Clara knew that if she wanted freedom, if she wanted justice for her mother, she could not keep running. She had to strike first. By midday, the grand hall of the Serenity Hotel was swarming with reporters, cameras flashing like a storm of lightning as Clara walked through its doors in a tailored black dress that clung to her like armor, her heels clicking against the marble floor with steady defiance, though dread coiled inside her. She had called the press conference under the guise of a financial review for Sterling Enterprises. But in truth it was bait, a trap to force Veronica and the board into the light where the truth could no longer be buried. Inside the hall, the board members sat in the front row, their faces pale and wary, and Veronica herself sat among them, regal and cold, her eyes sharp and mocking as Clara approached the podium. Clara's voice rang clear despite the pounding of her heart as she addressed the crowd, thanking them for coming before declaring that this was not a day for celebrating success but a day for uncovering truth. And as gasps rippled, she displayed copies of the financial transfers on the projector screen, numbers scrolling across the wall like confessions, offshore accounts, shell companies, signatures belonging to Donald Langston and Richard Sterling. For the first time, Veronica's smile faltered, though only for a heartbeat. Before she rose with icy grace, her voice dripping disdain as she called it nonsense, the desperate invention of a girl hungry for attention. Her protest was drowned out by the roar of the crowd as Clara connected the final thread, her voice strong as she revealed that her mother, Margaret Lawson, had died the night she discovered these transactions, that Richard Sterling had been dead within the year, and that these were not tragedies but murders disguised to look like fate. Cameras flashed wildly, reporters shouted questions, and the board exchanged panicked glances as Veronica's mask cracked further. She surged toward the stage, her voice shrill with fury as she warned Clara that she had no idea what she was playing with, that if she kept pushing she would end up exactly where her mother had. But before Clara could respond, the doors at the back of the hall burst open. Damian Sterling stormed into the room, pale but unbroken, his presence commanding silence even in the uproar. And as he strode to the stage, Clara's heart stuttered with shock. He mounted the podium and laid a steady hand on her shoulder, his gaze locked on Veronica with unyielding fire. His voice was calm but edged with steel as he said, "Enough. The past is done hiding. If you won't confess, the evidence will." Veronica's face twisted with rage, but in her eyes flickered fear, the first crack of defeat, and the room erupted again as uniformed officers led by Walter Sterling entered from behind. The law had finally come for the Queen of Ravenhurst. Officers closed in as Veronica fought, screaming promises of revenge, but her words dissolved beneath the roar of flashing cameras as for the first time she was dragged away, her empire collapsing underfoot like shattered glass. Clara's knees weakened as she watched the scene unfold, her chest tight with the release of it all, the truth finally torn into the open, the lies no longer powerful, enough to protect those who had built their thrones upon them. The chaos of the press conference still echoed in Clara Whitmore's chest long after Veronica Sterling had been dragged away. But as the crowd thinned and the cameras dimmed, Walter Sterling pulled Clara aside, his old eyes heavy with the weight of secrets carried for decades. His voice was low and rough as he told her there was something more she had to know, that long before Donald Langston had come into her mother's life, Margaret Lawson had been engaged to his son Richard Sterling, and the necklace she wore had never belonged to strangers at all. It was a Sterling heirloom passed through blood. Clara's breath caught and her knees threatened to buckle as he looked at her with trembling gravity and whispered that she was not only Margaret's daughter, but also a Sterling by blood. The revelation crashed through her like a tidal wave. She had spent every moment since arriving in Ravenhurst believing she was an outsider, believing she was fighting against the empire of the Sterlings, and yet here she was, bound by blood to the very dynasty she had sworn to destroy. The silver pendant that had been her last link to her mother now tied her directly into the family that had brought so much ruin, and as she stood there in stunned silence, the realization carved itself into her soul. Her fate had been entwined with the Sterlings from the beginning, and every step she had taken toward the truth had only been a step toward her own bloodline. That night she returned to the hospital, her heart trembling with both fear and hope as she pushed open the door to Damian's room. He lay there pale and weary but alive, his green eyes fluttering open as she entered, and she sat beside him, clutching his hand as she told him everything, every word Walter had revealed. For a long moment Damian said nothing, his gaze unreadable. But then his hand tightened around hers and his voice, still hoarse but steady, broke the silence. "Then maybe this isn't just about vengeance anymore," he said. "Maybe it's about rebuilding what they tried to ruin, together." Tears blurred Clara's vision as she leaned closer, whispering with trembling conviction, "I came here for justice, but what I found was you." And in that quiet room where the steady hum of machines kept time with his fragile heartbeat, Clara realized that her destiny had never been stolen. It had only been waiting for the day Damian Sterling would walk through her door and change her life forever. The storm over Ravenhurst had broken, but inside Damian Sterling's hospital room, there was only stillness, machines humming softly, monitors flickering in rhythm with the fragile rise and fall of his chest. And Clara Whitmore sat with his hand in hers, the weight of every secret, every revelation pressing against her heart. He was alive. He had opened his eyes, but survival was not victory because the people who had tried to silence them were still out there, circling like vultures. By dawn, the city was buzzing. News stations replaying the footage of the Sterling Gala shooting, speculating on the collapse of the empire. Rumors spreading of board members meeting in secret and whispers that Veronica had vanished like smoke into the night. But Clara knew that the fight was not yet finished. She returned to her apartment, pulled out the worn journal her mother had left behind, and traced the final entries with trembling fingers. Words that spoke of Donald Langston and Richard Sterling, of lies and death, of warnings to protect her. Margaret Lawson had died trying to reveal the truth, and Clara vowed she would not let it be buried again. That night she stood once more before the press, this time without glitter, without disguise, only the necklace at her throat and her mother's journal clutched in her hand. Cameras flashed as she lifted it high and declared her name, declared her bloodline, and laid bare every crime the Sterling and Langston families had hidden beneath the mask of power. Gasps rippled as documents were displayed, as recordings played, as truths long buried erupted into the open. And then the doors burst open, and Veronica Sterling strode in flanked by two men in black suits, her face pale with fury as she hissed across the chaos that Clara was a foolish girl, that Ravenhurst had always belonged to her and always would. But her triumph was short-lived as uniformed officers entered behind her led by Walter Sterling, his cane tapping against the floor as he spoke with hoarse authority, telling her that her reign was over, that the law belonged to her now. Cameras caught everything as officers surrounded her, her voice shrill with venom as she promised revenge. But the words dissolved beneath the roar of the press as the Queen of Ravenhurst was finally dragged away, her empire shattering like glass beneath the weight of truth. When it was over, Clara's knees weakened and she nearly collapsed with the release of it all. But that night she returned to Damian's bedside, her heart raw with everything she had endured. He was awake, weary but alive, and she told him everything. From Walter's confession to the revelation that she was not only Margaret's daughter, but also Sterling blood, tied forever to the family she had thought her enemy. For a long moment Damian only stared at her, his green eyes searching hers, and then he reached for her hand, his voice quiet but resolute as he said that perhaps this was no longer about vengeance, that perhaps it was about rebuilding what had been broken together. Clara's tears spilled as she leaned close, her voice trembling with conviction as she whispered, "I came here for justice, but what I found was you." And in that fragile silence, with the city trembling on the edge of change outside their window, Clara realized that her fate had never been stolen. It had only been waiting in the hands of the man who had once walked into her life by mistake and changed it forever.